All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unraveling a document for this explainer that honestly reads way less like your standard dry academic paper and a whole lot more like a literal intellectual thriller. We're going to be exploring the hidden, buried infrastructure of our cities, specifically San Francisco, and discovering how those physical networks perfectly mirror the hidden architecture of our own minds. So if you've ever felt like the prevailing wisdom of just, letting things go isn't really cutting it for you anymore, stick around. We're about to look at a completely new framework for how to construct your reality. Okay, let's dive into this. Right from the jump, the source material establishes this deeply poetic yet deadly serious tone. The core idea here is absolutely wild. The author proposes that urban architecture and human neurobiology don't just happen to look alike, but they actually operate on the exact same routing principles. We aren't just talking about a fun metaphor here, we're talking about structural survival.
Section 1. The Hidden Routing System.
To really wrap our heads around this theory, we first have to look at the physical ground it was built on. Think about San Francisco. Beneath all the neon signs and the busy traffic, there's this older, buried network. Underground passageways, smuggler stairs, totally forgotten machine rooms. These hidden spaces are our guiding metaphor for how cognitive networks function inside the brain. And to ground this, let's look at a real physical space, the San Francisco Art Institute, or SFAI. Now, this building isn't just real estate. It's a physical structure that literally holds a cognitive loop open over time. Founded way back in 1871, it spent decades in the late 20th century as this massive open aperture for feral, unchecked creative energy. By 2022, it hit bankruptcy and closure. But, and here's the kicker, the authors argue that the physical space itself still holds a charge, just waiting for a new loop, a third loop, to be routed right through it by 2026. The text actually gives us this fascinating anecdote to explain how this kind of routing works on a human level. It tells the story of a woman named Evelyn Cote, who quite literally programmed her shared apartment using a perfume called Black Orchid. She didn't just spray it in the air to make the place smell nice. No, she placed it super strategically, by the coffee maker, on the stairwell, and most importantly, right in the pockets of her partner's jackets. It was this brilliant act of territorial intelligence. She was effectively hacking the architecture of his habits, routing his cognitive pathways so that every single time he reached into his pocket, he encountered her memory before he even had time to form a conscious thought. And this brilliantly illustrates the core thesis we're looking at. There is a direct, literal translation between the macro scale and the micro scale. Just as Evelyn routed her partner's memory, and just as San Francisco routes its hidden life through those forgotten concrete tunnels and switchboards beneath the streets, your brain is doing the exact same thing. It's using neural pathways, axons, and myelin sheaths to route signals way beneath your conscious awareness. Route is everything. Section 2. The Limits of Letting Go. So, if our brains are essentially these massive, complex routing systems, what happens when our prevailing cognitive models fail us? Well, for the last decade or so, we've been operating under a model the authors call Rebus. You can think of Rebus as a kind of catechism of relaxation. Whenever you're overwhelmed, this model prescribes decompression. It basically tells you to surrender, right? Relax your rigid beliefs, loosen your expectations, and just let the chaotic bottom-up noise of the world flood into your mind so you can eventually find some peace. But the text pushes back hard against this idea, presenting a pretty stark scenario. It says, say you live in a place where the season keeps getting longer. The authors make the point that Rebus is great for a quiet, cozy winter. But what if you live in a world of constant metaphorical and literal fires? Drifting and passively relaxing your priors just isn't a viable survival strategy when the environment is actively demanding that you stand up and hold your ground. I mean, if you open all the windows during a firestorm, your house is going to burn down. Now, what's really interesting is when we pit these two philosophies directly against one another. On one hand, you have that REBS model, passive surrender, flattening out the cognitive landscape, letting go. On the other hand, we get the author's big revelation, the RVI model. This is all about compression, structural binding, active aiming, and actually building a load-bearing ridge. It's essentially the difference between just passively floating down a river and actively building a bridge across it.
Section 3. Recursive Vector Interference.
Okay, let's officially demystify this jargon, because once you break it down, it's actually incredibly practical. The text frames recursive vector interference, or RVI, not as some passive observation, but as an engineered collision of ideas right inside the switchboard of your mind. Let's break it down. Recursive just means it loops. You rehearse it over and over. Vector refers to streams of mental activity that actually have a specific direction, like a memory or sensory input.
And interference is what happens when you cross those streams. Think about it like two waves of water colliding to form a ridge. RVI is the practice of actively aiming two conflicting truths directly at each other until they interfere and form a brand new, highly stable cognitive pattern. The authors summarize this whole concept with a phrase that reads almost like a manifesto. Insight is constructed, not found. You don't just sit around, relax your mind, and wait to discover meaning while you're drifting. No, you engineer it. You take two conflicting ideas, you smash them together, and you literally hammer meaning into coherence through impact. It requires active, deliberate construction.
Section 4. The physics of coherence. To really grasp how this moves from a philosophical metaphor into hard science, we have to look at the physiology behind how the brain manages all these overlapping signals. And the mechanics here are just fascinating. Your brain acts incredibly similarly to a fiber optic network. Neurons aren't just firing at random. They actually harmonize through a process called phase locking. Your axons, they act as waveguides to direct the signal. The myelin sheaths act as protective cladding so the signal doesn't leak out, and your glial cells choreograph the exact timing. In this kind of system, timing matters so much more than volume. It's all about aiming light or, electrical signals, so they align perfectly.
The authors actually give us this incredibly concrete 5-step engineering specification for applying this to our own lives. First up, represent your mental streams as directional vectors. Second, aim them at each other using a carrier, like, say, matching a thought to the rhythm of your breathing. Third, induce interference to actually find that new stable ridge of insight. Fourth, rehearse the pathway. And fifth, establish guardrails. You absolutely must test the new pattern to ensure it doesn't cause harm to yourself or to anyone else.
Now, a quick warning, when you start forcing your brain to collide conflicting ideas like this, you might experience what the text calls recursion sickness. It's this sense of dizziness or like a mental flicker, but the source material is adamant that this isn't a bug in the system. It's actually an evolutionary necessity. It is simply the ache of your nervous system actively remodeling itself to create a brand new cognitive grammar. You are literally refactoring your mind under a heavy load.
Section 5. Terraforming the mind.
So what does this actually look like outside the individual mind? Well, when you scale it up to a civic level, RVI isn't just some abstract mental exercise. It creates highly tangible, real-world interventions. For example, when civic engineers aimed data about bus delays directly at data about asthma clinic admissions, they found an interference ridge exactly at 6:40 a.m. By fixing the bus schedule, they actively reduced asthma attacks. They used this exact same method to bind crab fishing season with school lunch programs to feed kids more sustainably, and they synced night court calendars with local childcare hours to help out working parents. This is what active cognitive engineering looks like in action. But, and this is crucial, the authors are incredibly strict about the boundaries of this power. The text explicitly states, if a binding does not produce a humane intervention, it is decoration. So there are very strict guardrails here. If you try to use this method of cognitive routing against someone without their consent, like to manipulate or control them, it is theft. Full stop. It's not a method. It must always be used to create greater freedom and coherence. And finally, none of this works without repetition. Reoccurrence is the absolute spine of the method. The text powerfully notes that our nervous system loves a calendar way more than it loves a sudden revelation. To turn a new mental path into a permanent paved street, you have to walk it every single day. As they say, you do not own a cognitive ridge that you do not actively walk. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and I want to leave you with a question to chew on. We've seen today that our minds aren't just passive, open windows waiting for a breeze. They are active, powerful switchboards waiting to be intelligently routed. So looking at your own life and the unique challenges you're facing right now, what two streams will you aim at each other to build your next insight? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will see you in the next explainer.